Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Museum of the American Indian in New York. My name is Kevin Gover. I am the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. And I welcome you to tonight's event, a conversation with the co-curators of Transformer Native Art in Light and Sound. I'd like first to extend a very special thank you to the sponsors of the exhibition and tonight's programming, Ameriprise Financial and the National Museum of the American Indian's New York Board of Directors. Transformer is the museum's first exhibition entirely composed of works using technology-based media and experiential art. 10 artists demonstrate indigenous identity in ways that challenge the viewer to think beyond stereotypes and to engage Native people and issues in a strikingly contemporary manner. Transformer was co-curated by NMAI's Associate Curator Kathleen Ash-Milby and Associate Professor of Visual Arts at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, David Garneau. Kathleen has made us proud as a recipient of 2 Secretary of the Smithsonian's Excellence in Research Awards. She's organized numerous contemporary art exhibitions at the museum, including most recently K Walking Stick, an American artist, and Glittering World, Navajo jewelry of the Ozzie family. Among her many accomplishments, she recently served as a fellow in the 2015 Center for Curatorial Leadership program here in New York. A citizen of the Navajo Nation, she earned her Master's of Arts from the University of New Mexico in art history, Native American art history. David Garneau is Métis, and his practice includes painting, curation, and critical writing. He recently co-curated Moving Forward, Never Forgetting, an exhibition concerning the legacies of Indian residential schools, other forms of aggressive assimilation, and reconciliation at the McKenzie Art Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan. He is part of Creative Conciliation, a 5-year curatorial research project funded by the Social Services and Humanities Research Council. He is also working on 2 public art projects in Edmonton, and his paintings are in numerous public and private collections. So please welcome Kathleen and David.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. We're really happy to be here tonight for the opening of Transformer Native Art in Light and Sound. I'm really pleased to be here with David Garneau. We've known each other for maybe about 8 years.
6, 8 years?
Yeah. We met working on a project that was actually an international Indigenous new media exhibition at the University of South Australia. And started our conversations, I think, then about our interest in this type of work. And began working on this exhibition in earnest probably about 2 years ago.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So we're just going to give you a little bit of information about why we chose to do this show and what it's about. And then we're going to give you, if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, we're going to talk to you just a little bit about the artists who are upstairs and give you a sneak peek of that. But did you have anything you wanted to add?
I want to acknowledge the artists are here. Can you put your hands up?
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to acknowledge that we are in Indigenous territories, and I'm really proud to be here as a guest. I want to thank Kathleen Ash-Milby for inviting me to this project. And if you've seen the exhibition, what you haven't seen is all the cords and lines and sweat and tears behind the scenes to give you such a fine finished product. So I want to give a round to the staff who made this all possible. I think some of them are here. Yeah, it's extraordinary. So we had so many ideas going into this exhibition. First and foremost is who to pick, who do you leave out? It's heartbreaking whenever you're doing this. And so we were looking at certain threads. Among the things we noticed right away is there were an awful lot of Indigenous artists who are being contemporary, but how do you be a contemporary artist? How do you be an Indigenous artist without losing strength in one or another? So this sweet spot of being an Indigenous contemporary artist is the thing we're most interested in. So we were looking at artists who were not just telling stories in a new media, film, video, but people who are also trying to transform particular media so that they would be of interest to other contemporary artists, as well as people who want to know about their culture. And yet the culture was still on display.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we spent some time together in Banff about a year and a half ago, and we're trying to figure out, we both knew we wanted to do something with artists working in this challenging electronic-based media, but there were people going in so many different directions. And we had a couple of different meetings before we started narrowing down and looking for trends. And one of the things that I was noticing is that there are certain artists who were doing things with the media where they were just creating these beautiful pieces. And this idea of using color and changing color. And also, I was becoming acquainted at that time with Raven Chacon's work, and he was explicitly working with sound as his media. So that's how we sort of ended up narrowing down this list and seeing that these artists who had this very particular aesthetic sensibility or concern in their work also seemed to be using the work to address some aspect of their tradition. So this could be trying to represent something that's very conceptual from their culture. It could be transmitting a story. There were kind of these different traditional threads that were running through this work that was actually very unconventional in terms of what people usually think about Native art.
Mm-hmm. I definitely like pieces that have that taste and flavor of the Indigenous community that some is coming from. But then if you were an Indigenous person, you would recognize yourself there, but there'd be something else. So we've got another master in the room here who wasn't in the exhibition, Ann Nicholson, who's famous for doing this. You look at a piece, it's clearly a piece of contemporary art, and then when you know, say, the two-row wampum or other kinds of imagery, suddenly you have to rethink that wampum. It becomes a contemporary object. And so we're interested in artists who are doing that. When you go to the exhibition, we'll go through some slides. I don't want to call them all out now, but that's a big theme. So people who are not just representing, making an illustration, but they're trying to dig deep and really renew these images and ideas.
Yeah, and I think that speaks also to the title of the exhibition, because this is something anyone who puts together exhibitions and things like this knows that the title is often that real challenge, because you want it to come up with a title that really captures some part of the essence of the show, but you don't want to be overly didactic or descriptive. And I always have to have a subtitle with all my titles. So it's my weakness. I have to have a little bit more. But we're seeing this idea of transformation coming out in a lot of the works. But I think that where it really hit home for me is a conversation I was actually having with Raven after doing this visit with him, and just starting to talk about what is it that this work has in common, because some of this work could be described as new media, but some definitions of new media are very narrow and are restricted only to digital-based art. And we didn't want to restrict the artists that we chose to only artists that worked in the digital realm. Some of the work is very sculptural, some of it's very experiential, but not necessarily digital. And so we kind of figured, when you boiled it down, what do they all have in common then if they're not technically new media? And you pointed out that we couldn't say that they were all using technology, because everything's technology, right? It's just the type of technology. But the one thing they all have in common is that they all need electricity. So that also worked with this idea of the transformer, right? So the artist is the transformer in this case, making that conversion.
I'm interested too in this notion. I think I first read in Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung about the necessity of the artist to take these old things, cliches, he calls them archetypes, and renew them. And that's a challenge in a conservative or a traditional community where you're just trying to preserve, you're trying to record, you're trying to keep consistency and vitality. And I'm really interested in what the Indigenous reception of this show will be. So Kevin McKenzie's piece, which we'll see in a slide in a few minutes, Going up just now with a group of people, I was feeling almost melancholic. You talk about it in terms of a pop art piece, which it is. And then when you were talking about ceremony, I was recalling, ceremony and how similar it is to Catholic passion play kind of feeling. And so there's these things that have kind of a smile or an ease about them, and then when you spend a bit more time with them, there's all these little layers of depth. And the other thing I was interested in this is true of Jon Corbett's work and many others, is there's so many things that echo through the collection, whether it's Métis beading and Anishnawbe beading, other beading, but this desire to communicate and delight, to make something that's beautiful, that attracts you in, but then there's more, there's always something that's missing. You need that orality to bring it to life.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually something that makes this exhibition more accessible to people, to the visitor. We've talked to a couple people. There've been a few previews and staff members and different people who've seen the work, and it's kind of interesting because a couple different people had said, well, I saw the title and I wasn't so sure, and I thought, I don't think I'm going to like it. And then they came in and were really surprised that it was so accessible and it was so beautiful and that they could understand some of these ideas and were really excited by it. And so that was very encouraging that, that this is a unconventional exhibition, but, we tried to make it accessible.
Yeah, I think so. Did we want to go through the slides?
Yeah, so we'll introduce you to some of the artists then. So the first artist that we have is Marianne Nicolson. And for those of you who've known the museum for a long time, and we opened here in '94, we hosted an exhibition, I'm trying to remember the exact year, I think it was around '97, that traveled from Canada, and it was called Reservation X. And Marianne Nicolson was one of the 7 artists in that show. So this is really wonderful for us to have her back again. Marianne lives in Victoria, British Columbia. She is a Kwakwa and Scottish descent. She is an author and painter and photographer and an installation artist. And one of the things she's been doing recently is working with light. On the slide that you're looking at right now near the top, there's a photo of a installation piece, I guess you'd call it, that she did at the Vancouver Art Gallery several years ago, where she designed this light projection that's shown on the outside of the building and transformed the architecture of the work. And she's really kind of followed this thread of working with light and light projection. And I actually put these up as kind of teasers if you haven't seen the installation. This is the designs of that she was working on to create the work, which is called The Harbinger of Disaster. And it's a work that is turned out to be very site-specific. It is a glass box that's created in the shape of a traditional Northwest Coast cedar box. Yes, it's usually painted and designed to hold treasure and precious things. But her box is clear, and it's this beautiful green glass. And her work is speaking to the flooding that's happened in her community and the flooding that's happened here, and this kind of threat of global warming and climate change, and how it's like the box is in some ways a microcosm of our place within the universe. It's a house, but it's also representing us as people and our vulnerability. What's different about this piece, and she's been experimenting not just with light as to use in a projection type mode, but also moving that light. So when you walk into the space, it's almost as if you're walking inside of the box, because the light is projecting her designs on the walls all around you, and the light's moving up and down. So this beautiful sea green, which is a reference to the water, right? The flood water. Is rising and falling. But it's also, the color green is also a reference to the color of money because of the location here in the Customs House. And when she was here doing a site visit a couple of months, well, I think it was probably almost a year ago actually, she was noticing these references to commerce in the building and even the green in some of the marble and picking up that color.
Mm-hmm. It was a real delight. She was here yesterday, and she's a very intelligent. We should say 2 of the artists have PhDs, and Jon Corbett's working on his, and so we have to really keep up. But she's talking very sweetly and calmly about, it's all the end of the world. We're all going to die. But it's happened before. It's going to be okay. But there was this sense of rising dread, and as it's going up, you feel like you're falling down. But also, each detail is wonderful. She tells a story, but when people are asking questions, then more comes out. So one panel has maybe the harbinger of death, an angel on one side, and then a devourer on the other side. And then 2 panels facing the doorway are two men, one indigenous, one non. And there's a sense of agreement in commerce or patriarchy. We don't know for sure. But there's all these levels of meaning. It's not just a traditional design. It's a traditional design that's been updated. There's the angel on that one, isn't it?
No, that's the monster eating the
That's
poor
the
little
front.
guy.
That's a devourer, yeah.
There's also some local references, like the beaver and the turtle, and I think the little guy with the hat is a Dutchman. I think that's
Right.
some of that trading of the beads for Manhattan. Okay, so I get the next one too.
It's you.
So this is Raven Chacon. He's a Navajo artist from New Mexico. He actually is part of a artist collective called Post Commodity that has received a lot of recognition and had a lot of really wonderful opportunities. They were recently in the Whitney Biennial. They were in also recently in Documenta. But the members of the collective also work on their own individual artistic practice. Raven is actually someone who was classically trained as a composer. And he works primarily with sound. So he's really kind of an experimental sound artist. What you see right here, this actually is not in the exhibition upstairs. It is a page from a score that we recently purchased from him for the collection. It's a graphic score. So what that means is that he's created 15 pages, and they are in the same orientation as you would have a musical score for an ensemble. And instead of traditional notes, he's using symbols and artistic marks that you find in Southwest art. And we're actually going to, as part of the programming for this exhibition next fall, he's going to be directing an ensemble that's going to perform this work. So each page is supposed to last 1 minute, and it can be any type of ensemble of musicians, and I guess there probably will be someone there who's keeping the time, but the musicians then interpret what the images mean. So keep your eyes open for that. For the installation upstairs, it's a piece called Still Life No. 3, and this work is actually a representation, a conceptual representation of the Navajo creation story. The Navajo creation story is something that's meant to be passed on as oral tradition. It's not meant to be something that's written down in one way in a book or told the same way every time. The story changes with each teller. The story changes over time. And in the story, the Navajo people move through these different worlds. And color is a really important part of the concept of the universe among the Navajo. And the 4 cardinal colors play a very strong role. So the colors are red, blue, yellow, and white. And so within the room where this installation is, the colors that are projected on the wall are constantly changing. And they're moving through these 4 colors, which are also associated with different times of the day. The concept for the piece is really that each color would appear in relationship to the time of day, right? But then that would kind of restrict how many colors you could see as a visitor, because no one's going to be here in the middle of the night. So he's compressed that schedule, but it's still reflecting that time across the day. There's also text panels on the walls with a reflection, a shadow reflection behind them in Navajo and in English. But the core of this piece is that it is a sound installation. So there are a row of speakers that sort of start at the floor and go up and over, and the voice of a woman who's reciting part of this Navajo creation story in Navajo. And there's a bit of a sound delay. So when you stand in this space, it's almost like you're in this kind of ethereal world where there are these shadows playing and the colors changing, and this voice is speaking to you, but it's not just coming out of a speaker, it's coming out of a series of speakers so that the sound moves. And it really reinforces that idea that, the story is changing, the words are changing, that nothing is static, everything is always in motion. So it's also kind of a tricky piece to represent. There's a couple of stills here of the text panel and of a previous installation. But when you're working with sound and having it move within a space, that's really hard to even like on a video or something, you couldn't really capture it.
The only thing I'll add is that Raven, after he was warmed up, with the Whitney and over at Documenta, he came to Canada and to my hometown of Edmonton, Alberta, where he was working on a project honoring 3 Indigenous women. Among them was my great-great-grandmother, Eleanor Garneau. I just need to shout that out. But it's also interesting about this permeability of the border. We can't imagine the medicine line away, but certainly in these co-curatorial projects and the movement of artists back and forth, there's really been a long-term dialogue among Indigenous artists and curators that I think is exemplified in this work.
Yeah, and actually, I think just to sort of follow that thread, I think that's why it also made sense for us to co-curate this exhibition, because I was looking to find someone who actually had a much better handle than I did on a lot of the work that was happening in Canada. And there are a lot of artists working in this kind of experimental media there. Did you want to say anything about why that seems to be sort of tilting more Canadian in that sense?
There's a long answer and a short answer.
Let's see, what time
the
is
short answer is that, the short answer is that there's incredible things happening in Canada in terms of indigenization and interest in what we call conciliation or reconciliation from the top down. There's been pressure from the bottom for years and years. People haven't been listening. So with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission around Indigenous people being, it's hard to even talk about it without getting upset. So the Indian residential schools, but also larger forms of colonization, people are actually taking it seriously. I was very skeptical at the beginning, 6-7 years ago, but now I really see people gaining an interest, and Indigenous people wanting to speak, but not just speak in traditional ways that are easily recognized, but in ways that are not easily recognized, so you have to lean in. And that brings me to thinking about Jordan's piece. We'll see it in a minute, but I just love that you have to lean in and you have to listen. You could have just broadcast things to us, but we have to listen, and we're not going to get everything, so you're not playing that Indian agent that was so common in the past. So there is funding. So the Canada Council of Arts is committed for 5 years of doubled funding more for Indigenous arts. And they're not just confining it to traditional forms, but they're really interested in artists who will engage the contemporary. And so a number of the artists in the exhibition are well known, but quite a few are not well known. And I was really interested in starting that dialogue for us to hear people that were not as known as well, who are going to speak in a different way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a good example. So I've written about this work a couple of times now for our little catalog and for an essay that'll be in the book coming out. And I didn't do enough care, I was looking at it on a small monitor, but seeing on the large monitor and seeing the carries taken in the beads that look like three-dimensional beads with the thread coming through, I really missed that. So what's extraordinary about this work is, like many other artists, Indigenous artists, they're really interested in generations and interested in spiral notions of time. So the idea of, we live a day, we live a month, we live a year, we have all these patterns that echo across. So every May we're going to have some things happen. So there's this spiral sense, and it's a linear sense of time, but it keeps recurring, repeating, and rubbing off on each other. And it's a different sense of living in the world. And so when you think of pixels running, a raster image, that's a very different grid system, and it reminds me of European perspective and how European cities are in a circular pattern, and then we have perspective and everything goes to a grid, and that started two big battles among Métis people who had a different river lot system, and suddenly they have to conform to grids. So when Indigenous people are entering into a new form like digital representation, and they're just translating their voices to these other forms, that's all right, but something is lost in translation. So Jon is doing really significant work by trying to Métis-ize, indigenize, Cree-ize the actual digital platform so that we have a different sense of bringing our voices in. But Jon will talk more clearly because this is part of a long-term PhD project. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and actually, this is a really interesting work to see in person. You know, we saw lots of different versions of this, but in the installation, it is blown up. It's blown up very large. And one thing that I think we were both struck by is that the pixels that form the beads, the virtual beads in this, when you get up close, you see it. They're like three-dimensional appearing beads. So it's not just like circles representing beads. It's like these are like little virtual globes, and you know the detail is amazing.
Yeah.
That's the right picture.
So another artist who's becoming very well known in Canada is Jordan Bennett, a young guy, Mi'kmaq guy from Newfoundland. And in this work, again, just like Jon is going back to community to learn Cree, Jordan has gone back to learn basket making from relatives of Ursula Johnson. The Johnson families are famous for this kind of work. But what I love about it is, as a contemporary artist, you can get into certain circles and ways of having conversations. You're jet setting around. Yeah, so all of us all the time, right? But I mean, you live in a certain ethereal plane. And what's really great about this next generation of artists is the humility of going back to community and saying, teach me. You know, teach me, show me something. And I'm not just going to replicate it, but I'm going to put it in a new skin. I'm going to make something new out of it. And so I really admire what Jordan's doing, and his wonderful partner, Amy Melbuff, another Métis woman. There's so many people who are getting enthused by this next generation. So we're seeing more beaters, tufters, people working with this media that they didn't think was art before. So this is a significant change. And that it's not just visual and beautiful, which it is, but also has these layers of meaning as something that draws people in, Indigenous and not.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to mention, because one of the things that's interesting about this piece, it's one of two pieces that were supported by the museum that didn't exist before and were created for this exhibition. And he was actually inspired very specifically by some images in our collection.
So the images were from 1930. I think he was also a Johnson, wasn't he? An anthropologist who came to the community and took photographs. And the Jador family. And so he, again, like Marianne, wanted to do something that was going to resonate with this space, not just bring something in. And I think that's another thing I see common in Indigenous contemporary artists, is wanting to respond to the community, to have a dialogue, rather than just imposing something that comes from another culture. It can be a form of, you know, I was going to say colonization, but it's more like showing off, you know. There's this less of a dialogue, but this is a very dialogic piece. Again, when he was talking about the work initially, he was going to go to the community, record sounds from the community, talk to the elders, the masters in the basketry and weaving medium. But when he brought the sound files, okay, so this is behind the scenes a few weeks back, we're listening, there's nobody talking, and the essay's already out. And to me, this is actually very significant. When we go back to community, when we're working with community, we don't want to be the Indian agents just showing things like an anthropologist would. We have to be held to account. So not giving everything away causes people to listen more and for the things that aren't there. And in this case, it's a wonderful moment where, as you say, you've put this, I only knew now that you made a special case for this microphone to go in the river. And the sound that sounds like a drum beat is actually rocks in the river clanking together. This reminds me of a little story. Recently, I was going back to my community in Edmonton, and you know, the elders are always saying, you know, listen to the land, you'll learn everything from the land. And Julie Nagam's work is about this too. And I was telling to this elder, you know, I went to the river valley, I was listening to the land, and he says, that's good. And what did you hear? And I said, I was telling all the things I heard, and he says, but you know the land speaks in Cree, right? And I grew up in that city, and I'm working on a couple of public projects there, and Jerry Saddleback was, you know, revealing the land underneath the land, all these things that were there. And I feel that Jordan's work is very respectful. He's going back to the community, not just revealing it as a text, but something you have to engage. So I think it's a remarkable piece that brings these photos to a different kind of life as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's also really a sound installation. It has a very physical, sculptural presence, and there's a detail on the screen of some of the covers on the speakers that compose the majority of this installation. And I do think that you're really drawn very close to them because it's this kind of soothing sound, but really kind of interesting because you can't quite put your finger on what it is you're hearing. And again, that pulsing sound, it's like, is it a drum or is it, and to find out that the microphone was underwater and that it was actually this natural sound that was occurring in the river, which was actually at the location of one of the pictures that is on the wall, was really quite fascinating.
And it's an interesting feature of the show. I mean, I think that, the future of Indigenous curation will include more touching, and we're not allowed to touch anything, but nothing's stopping you from leaning in really close and smelling, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And also the way the sound, the institution here has worked really hard with sound engineers, and there's a wonderful bleed in a good way of one nature sound into another. You got to stand back for some, you got to lean in close for others, and so there's a bit of a haptic experience that goes with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the next two artists actually worked as collaborators on a work, Marcella Ernest and Keli Mashburn. Marcella is an Ojibwe Anishnawbe artist who is really known, I think maybe primarily as a filmmaker, but has expanded her practice and is working in more experimental forms with film and video. Keli Mashburn is an Osage artist and photographer from Oklahoma, and I found out actually today that they met at the Institute of American Indian Arts years ago, and so their collaboration grew out of a long friendship and continuing conversations about their work. And eventually they decided to make this 2-channel video together. It's titled Thaw, and Thaw is an Osage word that means chaos. And Keli tried really hard to explain to me this concept and this complex concept that really was it wasn't just chaos. And I think about the Navajo worldview and this idea of a hojo. And hojo is beauty, but it's more than beauty. It's harmony and it's balance and it's all these things. And there's not just a one-word translation. So Thaw has the same kind of complex meaning, and it's about and the piece is trying to express this idea of the power of chaos and the transformative power of chaos, and looking specifically, drawing from Keli's photography of the land in Oklahoma near her home that is constantly being transformed by fire, because wildfires hit intermittently, and it's something that's a natural process. It's very destructive. It destroys the grasslands. Everything is burnt and charred, and you'll see all these different images flashing, including these almost kind of moonscape type looking images, and not even realize what you're looking at. And they're sideways and they're upside down and they're mirror images, and it's really getting at that idea of chaos. But there's renewal that comes from that destruction. So eventually you see, the different seasons and the way the grasslands change, and this is interwoven with images of Osage cultural practice and some archival footage, and a really beautiful soundscape that combines different sounds that Keli associated with the place and with her culture: tinkling bells, wind chimes, crickets, lightning strikes. It's really a very powerful piece to sit through. So that's one of the pieces in the exhibition that you really should try to get there and see it from beginning to end. So if it's halfway through, wait for it to start again. It's only a few minutes, but it's very immersive, I think, because of that soundscape.
And I might be reading it wrong, but I hope not. But in watching it, it was so different from seeing it on small monitors, the way we were receiving it in the past, and the sound was the first thing that attracted me. But I'm really interested in the sense of time, because you move forward, you move back. And I started, when I was watching it again this afternoon, I was wondering, who is the viewer? Who is the maker? And I felt like it wasn't a human contemporary person. It was a timeless person. And so it really disorients your sense of viewing. And I think that repeating viewing, hopefully alone, will reveal this other sense of making. So you've got in the collaboration a still photographer and someone who's animating and using some video or old film footage. And when you're watching them together, it's a montage for sure, but there's this other sense of time, and it makes you feel yourself as a different kind of being in that space. It's very unique.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, Stephen Foster.
So Stephen Foster is an Haida artist, and he's somewhere up here. And again, it's very difficult for speaking for people who are right here in the space, and a professor on top of that. I was attracted to this piece because, again, there's something that's very straightforward, a tent. It's not it's a high-tech tent. It's something that's contemporary. And yet there's something that's happened, and you can imagine happening with these shadow puppets. An older person is talking to is showing a younger person a story of ravens stealing the sun, stealing the light, kind of a Prometheus story. But you could have that enacted in a tent or happen in a cave wall or other forms of firelight. And I felt that it would be something, well, we imagine people coming in, children coming in, what's going on in there? It's something that really attracts you right away, and then there's all these other levels. But again, like other pieces in the show, you have a sense of getting a taste of something, but not the full thing. It reminds me of another story. I was working with an artist, a master's student, Keith Bird, and he wanted to really do some work around ceremony. And the elders said, well, no, of course not. That's not to be in this world. And he kept insisting he wanted to find some way through art to make a portal so you could enter into these stories, into the ceremony, especially directed toward Indigenous people who were sort of disenfranchised from their culture. How am I going to get in there? And so the elders, Roy Bison and others, got together, and they came back, a few weeks later, and they said, 10%. You can show 10%. And the idea was a taste, a feeling that there's these things happening, this continuity, this culture that's been going on that is not historical alone. It's part of a continuous narrative, continuous set of behaviors. And if people could see that it exists, they couldn't assume that it doesn't exist, but then they might want entry in. And I find that this piece is quite modest that way. It's cute, it's interesting. There's a sound component that changes as you get close to it, so you get this high-tech interactivity. But it's very simple, very modest, but speaks of so much more. So I think it leads you into other collections, other stories. So it's a gateway piece.
Yeah, and I also think that this idea of storytelling is a thread that runs through the exhibition, and passing on between generations. So I think of Jon Corbett's piece and that the portrait of the four generations being beaded and unbeaded, and also Raven's piece is something about oral tradition. And in Stephen's case, you don't actually hear words. It's like a hand shadow puppet telling of the story, or an excerpt of the story. And you do hear, if you're listening carefully, you do hear a child laugh. So you get that idea of that passing on that story to your children.
Again, I'm talking about somebody who's right here. So Kevin McKenzie is an artist from Regina, where I live, from the plains, Cree and Métis. And this is a challenging piece to talk about. As I was hinting earlier, there's an aspect of it that is pretty straightforward and poppy and fun and pleasing. It's got that sort of retro feel with the neon. But in talking to him, it's interesting. The skulls are not actual buffalo skulls, but they're cast from buffalo skulls. And there's this sense, again, of not wanting to be disrespectful by including the actual medicine in a room, but a copy of it. But then that is like a degraded form. It's not the real thing. It's a shadow of the thing. And so where are we? How can we be spiritual in this secular space? I felt a feeling, too, that of ceremony in terms of the slashing red that reminds me of blood, that is both in Catholic sense of ceremony and passion plays, but also in Sundance ceremonies. And so there's this feeling of pop art and fun and lightness and this sense of I want to think of it as melancholy, almost like a ghost dance feel, of not being able to be access and represent something exactly, but giving a stand-in. I think of it as a screen object to both echo the thing that it's displacing, but also not to disrespect the thing that it's trying to evoke. So it's a very tense act, and I think it works really well in this space. I enjoyed walking through. You've got 2 screen flat pieces on either side, and when I first saw it quite flat, and this sort of gained in dimension. And there's this almost like this kneeler in the Catholic Church where you kneel before the lights you set up. There's this very religious feel to it. So.
Yeah, and actually I think it's the only work in the exhibition that really is explicitly addressing Christianity. I mean, the title is Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And that relationship that the artist has between this Christian education growing up and his culture. And that, sort of wrestling with that and that conflict over time and sort of trying to reconcile that. Yeah, it's a very powerful piece. It's also one of the pieces that isn't using like a digital media. It's very much a sculptural form, and does add that kind of dimensionality to the exhibition.
But you plug it in.
You plug it in.
So it counts. Yeah. It's in the show. Close call, man.
Okay, Julie.
So again, Julie's
He's right
here
there.
too. So this piece, I am embarrassed to speak for you, but the original idea was to have this space that you're walking into that is evoking Manitoba, your actual territory, your actual home, and trying to bring that to a busy center like this. And I think that's something that I find in all the pieces, this sense of obvious materiality and metaphysical. And in thinking about this, I'm interested in traditions around the world, European traditions, Asian traditions, of how is it that you represent the metaphysical through material means. And more often than not, you might use a precious material like gold or jewels as a pure form, but also things like light and smoke are often used because those are things that seem physical. We know they're physical, but they seem immaterial as well. And projected light had this feel for me. So we're looking at something that's flat painting and so on, but with this very subtle animation and projection, there's movement, there's cartoon figures, but they're not cartoony. And it's a way, again, of evoking something without trying to replace it. It's an illustration that's meant to bring you into this space. But most importantly to me is, again, this idea is the future is in the land if you listen to it, and you're providing translation in a sense. So we've got elders speaking, we've got animals speaking, and as you know from going through this museum or familiar with Indigenous philosophy, the divisions between the human and the animal, our space and their space, there isn't this us and them kind of thing. So there's all this movement back and forth. And I found this piece very mesmerizing now that it's operating, in the sense that I don't find myself exactly in that space. I found myself in the thought of that space, the feeling of that space without it displacing that space. It's no substitute for being actually there. And it makes you feel, again, I'm feeling melancholic again, feeling melancholic, the thing that all art is about something that's not present. And I think all these works here try and bring that presence without displacing it. And this one really gets that across. And there's no substitute from hearing an elder, So that, again, that kind of humility. We're channeling some of this knowledge. We don't own it.
This is also, I think, one of the pieces in the exhibition that is very experiential, where you feel like you could just sit there and just watch it and just stay there with it. And actually there are chairs and like a very comfy chair in that room where people, I think, are going to be spending a lot of time. Okay, so the last artist in the exhibition is Nick Galanin. And I thought this would be a really good artist to close with in a way, because this piece, which I'm not going to pretend I can pronounce it in Tlingit, but it's titled, "We Will Again Open This Container of Wisdom That Has Been Left in Our Care." And this is actually the oldest work in the exhibition. It's from 2006. And it's by Tlingit artist Nicholas Galanin. Nick is really a hard to describe artist. He's worked in so many different types of media. Everything he does, I think, is very conceptual. I think that's the one commonality about his work, but he's This is his only video work that I'm aware of. He's worked in sculpture, he's done a lot of things with digital imagery, but he also makes jewelry, he's a musician, so his work isn't really about the process per se, it seems like it's more about the ideas. This is a work that is comprised of 2 separate videos. The first one we have a still from on the left, and the second one on the right. And it's kind of an interesting piece because in some ways its genius is its simplicity. So the first video, you see this non-native dancer who is in a loft in Brooklyn, and the soundtrack is a Tlingit raven dance soundtrack, and very traditional sounding. And the other video is a raven dancer who's dancing in a community center in Sitka, Alaska, but the soundtrack that is behind him is this very sort of high-tech electronic beat. Mm-hmm. And David, you were saying that the first time you saw it, you thought, oh, he just like flipped the soundtracks. Yeah. But actually, he had these dancers perform and improvise to the music. So they are responding very directly to what they're hearing. And it's kind of like playing with your idea of what you expect, you know, what you're expecting when you see this. And, you know, thinking about those ideas about tradition and about, you know, especially with this title about how he is challenging us and talking about our responsibility to take care of culture and to move it forward. Mm-hmm.
I'm really taken by Franz Boas visited these communities and so many other communities, and he wrote an essay in turn of the last century, something to the effect of, in going to these communities, there's 2 kinds of people. There's the traditionals who just want to keep things the way they are as much as possible, and then there's these other people who just want change, just for the sake of change. And they're both impulses, right? It's not rational. You can come up with reasons for it, but you're disposed one way or another. And when I first saw this piece, I thought, oh, you went too far. They're gonna hate him back. But he lives in his community. He does traditional carving as well. And so contemporary artists are nudging traditional people forward and also respecting and engaging. So there's this dialogue back and forth, but the dialogue also goes across culture until, you know, reserve systems sort of isolated people and past laws came into effect. There's lots of transit and trade. And so this transit and trade across cultures, I think, is a very important part of this work and the exhibition.
So, I mean, we could just keep going on and on, but I think we want to just leave a few minutes here for any questions. I'll put the other screen. I'm excited for you guys to see it who haven't seen it already. Okay, so we've got 2 people with mics that are walking around. If you have a question, raise your hand and they will hand you a mic so we can hear your question and everyone else can also. So, are there any? I'm a little blinded here.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to see. House lights are coming up a little bit.
I know there are people out there. Does anyone have any questions? All right.
One over here.
Comes one.
Thank you very much for your context for the exhibition. You did a wonderful job, so congratulations. How do you adapt work like this to the rooms that they're in? How much of a challenge is it? We had the chance to speak to some of the artists about adapting, and you talked a little bit about coming a year ago for a site visit so that they could adapt the work perhaps, but could you speak a little bit about using these unique spaces within the museum and how you had to, were there compromises or was it adapted?
Well, I think that sort of speaks also to our selection process, because the galleries in New York, this is a wonderful historic building, but you know, we have challenges because our galleries are narrow, you know, we have a limit of space, unlike our museum in Washington, which is enormous galleries. So that was definitely something that impacted our selection. And we were really lucky to have artists who did respond to the space that we gave them. And it was kind of an iterative process. Like, for instance, in talking to Raven, I saw several works by him, but the one that about the Navajo creation story I thought was like right on the nose for our exhibition. But I wanted him to know the space that we had, which was actually much larger than the space he installed this work before and if that would even work. And luckily he was really excited by that, and it was something that we could work with. So it's always kind of that adaptation to what we have. We have a really great team of designers here that are able to really see our space in different ways and ways to adapt it. But then in other cases we did, like with Jordan, I think we did show you like layouts of what the floor plan was and about how much space you had, and sort of went from there, coming up with a new piece.
I like your use of the word unique. It's like I have unique relatives. All these artists are unique. But it's, for me, the big challenge was the relational. How are these things going to get along together, right? Because they're competing. This one's too loud. This one's too quiet. How do you balance that? And this is why, hats off to the staff here. I found the sound component was the most concerning, and being at a distance, I was here for a number of visits, but this terrified me, really did. But also, it's hard to describe, but the feel that happens when rooms change their color, and Jordan's got this thing for pink. It's my least favorite color until now. And so you walk through and your mood changes, at least my mood changes walking into each room. But there are so many threads. Jordan's piece, for instance, like Ravens, has a sound that travels. It's not just coming out of one speaker. So there's all these little details that I just find are coincidental, elegant, beautiful, but it's, I heard this definition recently about what an intuition is, and intuition isn't just this voice from above or from beyond, it's also recall, right? And when I go through these spaces, I'm recalling so much in terms of feeling, in terms of insight and ideas, and I think it's something that a number of these indigenous people are recalling for and with each other. So there's that intuitive sense of walking through and this feeling of echo that I find most remarkable. But there's also a tendency among curators just to say too much, right? And we could have chosen so many more pieces and then shoehorn them in, and we did it. We got these voices, but it would have not worked aesthetically. We're different people, but something we have in common is this aesthetic feel that led to not a single fight, because we just had a feel, and I think of it as intuition or the sense of recall.
Any other questions? Oh, got one over here.
When you were describing one of the pieces, you described it as medicine, and I'm curious if you can expand a little bit on what medicine means and how that's related to these artistic works.
Oh, yay.
I think that was you.
See, it's really interesting. There are many, many artists indigenous artists who really don't want to be show and tell about their traditions. And there are many artists who are materialists, indigenous artists who don't have those connections. I was at an opening maybe 8 years ago with the great performance artist Rebecca Balmore, and I was asking her just that question about whether she thought her work had medicine value, was metaphysical in any way, and she says, no. She walks away and she comes back, she grabs me by the shirt and says, accept this. And she told me this dream she had. It just blew my hair back, right? So there are some things where, like I was saying with Jordan pieces, this is doing medicine, but it's not going to tell you, take this tablet. It's about a relation rather than an object. To me, that's the most important thing. And it does a bit of violence when we have these objects brought in and they're in a container in a room. And it can be very hard from a curatorial point of view to take something from its living environment and put it in this space. The insight that I have walking through, spending time with this exhibition is that through sound, through some of these visual things that aren't just like pictures on a wall or these wonderful regalia that are without their dance, I can bring them to life because I've been to these powwows, but other people, their costumes. How do you get past that? And contemporary artists are really struggling with that, and I think this is an exhibition where they're succeeding. I'm not answering your question. Because for me, the medicine is not something you take internally, it's a relationship. And if you find something in these objects or in these sounds and these relations that stirs something that's lost, that's missing, that needed healing, then that will be medicine for you. But again, this indigenous notion of not separating one thing from another is really important. These things are in relation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that something I'd like to add is just that I think as artists and as Native people, I think that part of understanding tradition and things like you might refer to as medicine is understanding that there are things that we're not meant to share, or even that we're not meant to know. And that's something that really goes contrary, I think, to a Western understanding of knowledge, that all knowledge is there for anyone who wants it and who seeks it. And having that sense of humility that there is information that, I don't need to know and I'm not supposed to know, and that's how it's supposed to be, and that's okay. I think that's something that artists struggle with and have to reconcile in their work, and that's why they may just give you a hint of something, but they're not like laying it all out for you, because that might not be for them to do, and you don't really actually need to know all that in order to understand something about the culture. Yeah. And I think that's true for artists. I think that's true for us as contemporary Indigenous people as well, having that respect.
I've got to tell another story. So this artist that I mentioned earlier, Keith Bird, had this dream, and he was carving. He saw this staff, and he carved the staff, and he showed it to his elders, and they said, "Wow, we haven't seen these for like 100 years." And then he took it, right? Because it wasn't Keith's, it was part of this culture. And to me, that's an important lesson. This object is in relation. It's not something that he came up with, he owned. Same with the weaving. Jordan didn't weave that. He weaved it, but he's the vessel for all the weavings that preceded it, and more importantly, all the weavings that are going to go on in the future. So we're just this one moment.
And I think that's a really good note to end on. David and I are going to be in the gallery for about a half an hour. For those of you who did not go on the VIP tour, we'd be happy to answer more questions. The artists are going to be here mingling if you want to meet them. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and I hope you enjoy the exhibition, and see you upstairs.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the artists, too.